Hey, this is part 2 of trends in social institutions. In the previous video, I was able to get through 1, which were the trends in government and politics. I just have the slide up, so they're all going to cohesively, all 8 of them will be in this part 2. I'm not going to go over them since I discussed it in the previous one. So this is the first social institution, which is government and politics. The second is economy. So the functionality of economy in the framework of social institutions is that economy is primarily responsible for regulating the production, distribution, and consumptions of goods and services. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. Economy tends to be a pretty known term in functionality. So some trends that are present in economy is there's a lot of economic globalization. I think that one's pretty obvious as it's been growing pretty significantly over the past years. Some of the trends that you'll see is there is this drive for increased profit by companies. And so they seek out a cheaper labor force that often is present in overseas companies, so cheaper labor, cheaper materials, which often then results in cheaper goods or cheaply made goods. But it's a low cost to the company, which then they can bump up they can bump up the markup quite a bit to make the profit, or they can mass produce at a cheaper price so they can have a cheaper selling point to the consumer, so the consumer buys more. And then they get the profit that way. And so that's kind of a trend. It's really interesting to kind of see how that plays out kind of on a global scale. Obviously, there's the impact on workers. If you hear, there's lots of documentaries and stories around like the clothing market and kind of like the sweatshops overseas, what that looks like at the expense of the health and safety of workers, even the economy, the environment, what the mass production of goods at a cheap cost does to the environment with pollution, with cutting down of trees, and how that can change the environmental landscape, and is the cost benefit really paying off for some of this globalization. And so another trend, if you think more specifically in the United States, is this concept of labor force bifurcation. And so that's kind of this, or to bifurcate, I hate some of these words. It's dividing into 2 branches. So when you apply that to the economic framework, you're kind of looking at this division of like almost the blue collar worker to the white collar worker. And what does that look like? There is a trend where there's more probably kind of that manual labor mindset and more of the skilled labor mindset. What advantages are being in place for those who are in more of what you consider a white collar job versus a blue collar job? Some of like the social implications, but even the financial implications, opportunity implications. And so there's this labor force split that can really impact how people vote, how people navigate different things. And it often comes down to sometimes what benefits are available to individuals in each of those labor forces, and then there's some level of discrimination around that as well. There has been some slowed economic growth over the past few years. We're seeing that a little bit more even now, kind of with inflation. Labor and materials are a little bit more sparse. There was a couple years ago, a year or two, I don't even remember, maybe it was last year, when they talk about cargo ships out in sea not being able to get into port or be able to get the goods, and there were shortages around things, around wood and lumber. And so economic growth has slowed, and that does impact an economy and kind of revenue streams for individuals, and then raising prices. That's definitely a current trend. There's a lot of downsizing and outsourcing. So I kind of mentioned that in the economic piece, that jobs are going overseas. And what does that then mean for individuals who are physically in America? Job opportunities might not be as present. And I think if we even look at, unemployment in light of COVID and kind of employee shortages at a lot of places, that is definitely a trend that I think will be explored that obviously hadn't occurred at the time the textbook was published. All right, trends in education. There is an increased focus on education on the global level, which is really good because historically there has not been equal opportunity and access to education for all on a global sphere. Some of that can be if you are living in a more impoverished country, children are often utilized as a means of income for families. So children will go work as a means to provide for their family versus engaging in education. That's just basic, simple survival that they are engaging in. Not saying that that is healthy and right for a child, but it's kind of getting their basic needs met. So that's been present. There's been some discrimination against females being able to receive an education. Those are different trends that are thankfully being addressed at a global level, and there's a lot of initiatives in place. So concerns for the United States education system. It's really interesting. The book talked a lot about a lot of misinformation that's around testing performance of students in the United States and how that is utilized at times to it's kind of like this, I don't know how to explain it. So like some of the more wealthier families in the United States, they actually name dropped the DeVosses, but also like people who own, I think it's the Waltons who own Walmart. I'm not even sure. But some of these more wealthy families have said, hey, education in the United States sucks. We have to privatize. We need to step away from public school education. It ends up being discriminatory, whether it's intentional or not, because funds are then being taken out of the public school system. And there's not a ton of evidence to show that the United States was ever at a position that we were high performers in the educational sphere. So yes, we're testing lower, but we've consistently tested lower. And so it's just really interesting to kind of look at it through that lens that sometimes, and again, I'm just kind of reflecting on it. I'm not saying that these families are doing things in a negative motivator, but sometimes altruistic attempts might not actually be beneficial to all. But it is actually pretty consistent that we do rank lower in aptitude based on standardized tests. And there's a growing gap. And there's always been a growing gap between white-black education. And so individuals who are in a predominantly white school tend to have more educational opportunities than individuals who are of color. However, there is actually some growing evidence to show that economic status might actually be more of a relevant diversity factor to look at, because they'll say that individuals of color or Black Americans who came from more wealthy environments tested higher than individuals who are white that might have been in the Appalachian Mountains, which is notorious for having high poverty levels. And so they're kind of looking at that more so than color, although it's those are two very valid areas of disparity that the educational system really kind of discriminates against. Oh, I didn't talk about the function of education. It's to pass along formal knowledge from one generation to the next. All right, trends in healthcare. Healthcare's primary function is to promote the general health of a society. That's kind of a duh when you think about healthcare. Very interesting. I think that if you're looking at the global context, a lot of developed countries, and not even developed countries, but many countries besides the United States look at healthcare as a basic human right, and so that lends to that concept of universal healthcare. In America, it is not identified as a human right, which is why we do not have universal health care here. And so it is a benefit of a job or some sort of status position that one needs to acquire. It's not something that's given to them just based on the fact that they are a human. So that is a huge disparity between the United States and kind of the global community. We also have a lot of disparities within the country about access to healthcare. And so because it's not a universal right, we have, a lot of times you access healthcare through your insurance. If you don't have healthcare insurance through your employer, if you don't have a job, you then either have to buy it through the private marketplace or you have to qualify for Medicaid or Medicare. And so there's a lot of disparity about equal access to healthcare in the United States. So, in Obama's presidency, he made a huge initiative to move towards universal health care with the Affordable Health Care Act. This was not supported by the Trump administration, so a lot of initiatives that Obama put in place by having like the marketplace requiring everybody to have health insurance, having more higher eligibility for Medicaid, those did not get supported during the Trump administration, so there hasn't been a ton of consistency or progress towards making a change due to different political parties having different viewpoints. And so that kind of tends to be something that's hanging in the air still. So there's a focus on doing more preventative care to reduce the cost of those insurance premiums. So a lot of healthcare institutions, I guess, are focusing on like having those well checks, doing your annual physicals before something goes wrong in order to prevent having those reactive interventions down the road. So we talked a lot about this with the biological person, how lower socioeconomical status just kind of introduces a plethora of disparities and how individuals who have a lower SES tend to have higher health concerns based on their income and kind of social class. And so when we're talking about preventative care, is that something that's actually accessible to all, or is it just to those who have health insurance and have some sort of health literacy and are able to navigate that system? I'm kind of speeding through these because I want to not have video 3, I mean. So trends in social welfare. These social welfare functions to promote interdependence and to deal with issues of dependence. And so you're kind of looking at, is this the government's role to provide social welfare programs? Is it non-governmental participation? Social welfare is looked at differently in different countries. Social welfare in America tends to have this high emphasis on everyone needs to be independent, and social welfare breeds a culture of dependency, where other cultures view social welfare as more of a partnership and an empowerment piece to get individuals' needs met. So there's kind of this differing views, and then that also then kind of impacts how individuals will vote or support or promote social welfare programs. And so this kind of trickles down into specific populations in the United States. We have a very high aging population, and so those in that population will soon be accessing their Social Security benefits, their Medicare benefits. Well, what happens when we don't have those individuals paying in anymore? Is that a social welfare program that's sustainable? It's something that's going to be very prevalent down the road because we do have that baby boomer generation that's now accessing those benefits. America has no paid maternity leave, and we are, I think, one of the only 2 developed countries who do not give that. And so there is a huge concern for maternal wellness around not having access to that maternity leave. Childhood poverty is a huge concern in America, and we're seeing a lot of educational and health impacts, both mentally and physically, on children who've grown up in poverty and the implications that has for them long term. Trends in religion. Christianity is still the most dominant in the United States, but there's much division within. All of these could be summed up in this recent election because they were all very present, and there was a lot of division within Christians around how to navigate these, and it causes a lot of bitterness and division, so it's not even a united religion. But religion's function is to address spiritual and ethical issues. Globalization does expose us to different beliefs and religions, and so I love this, that if there were 10 people in the room, there would be 3 Christians, 2 Muslims, 2 unaffiliated, 1 Hindu, 1 Buddhist or other East Asian religion, and 1 other. That's kind of the diversity of religion globally. And so having a more globalized society, we are able to see the differences and celebrate that there is a big diversity in religion.